Good evening. I'd like to get started, if we can take our seats. My name is Cesar Perales. I have the privilege of serving as chair of the 2018 Charter Revision Commission. As is our custom, I will begin the proceedings by asking the members of the commission that are here to introduce themselves, and I'll start on my left. Dale?
Good evening. My name is Dale Ho, and I am a lawyer at the American Civil Liberties Union.
I ask that everyone speak up, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Archer, and I'm a law professor here at NYU Law School.
My apologies. Good evening. My name is Aneta Sichern, and I'm the executive director of Chaya Community Development Corporation.
Hello, my name is Wendy Weiser, and I direct the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice here at NYU School of Law.
Good evening, I'm Sharon Greenburger. I'm the president and CEO of the YMCA of Greater New York.
Good evening. My name is Rachel Gotzel. I'm the vice chair of the Commission of
You have to press the button, that one.
Good evening again. My name is Rachel Gotzel. I'm the vice chair of the Commission, a professor at Rutgers Law School, and a co-founder and director of research for the Perception Institute, and it's wonderful to see all of you out here tonight.
As I indicated, my name is Cesar Perales. I was formerly the Secretary of State of New York. I previously served as Deputy Mayor of the City of New York. I've had a long history in civil rights as an attorney with a particular interest in voting rights.
Good evening, everyone. Carlos Shasura. I serve as the Secretary of the Commission, and I currently serve as the President and CEO of the New York Building Congress. Prior to that, I ran the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce, and before that served as Chief of Staff to Brooklyn Borough President Marty Markowitz.
Good evening. My name is Mendy Mirachnik. I'm sorry. Good evening. Oh, thank you. Good evening. I'm Mendy Mirachnik. I'm president of COJO of Staten Island. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good evening. I'm Kyle Bragg. I'm Secretary-Treasurer of SEIU 32BJ. I'm also a member of Community Board 13 in Queens.
Good evening. My name is Marco Carrion. I'm currently Commissioner of the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit.
I generally take a few minutes to describe what Charter Revision Commissions do, but I do think that at this point, people understand that we are in the midst of hearing from the public on numerous issues. This mayor was particularly interested in democracy and in reforming election and in getting more people engaged in the civic life of our city. But we have looked at the entire budget, heard testimony, not the entire budget, but the entire charter. And we've heard testimony regarding the entire charter. Where we are now in our process is that the staff has just issued a preliminary report. It was a report directed at the members of the commission, but it's a public document. And it is an attempt to have us narrow the issues so that we can focus on some of the issues that have been uppermost in the minds of the public and the people who have sent comments to us and testified before us. So that you will be hearing, I think, primarily on a limited number of issues. Let me just say that we hope to hear from as many people of the public as is possible. This is our Manhattan hearing. We're going to do one in every borough. And last time, when our first go-around, we went around and had neighborhood meetings in a number of places, so that we've had an opportunity to hear from many of the people of the city of New York. just go over the ground rules for today. We're going to try to move as quickly as possible. We will limit the comments to 3 minutes. We have a clock, and when I'm told that the 3 minutes are up, I will so inform the speaker. We will use panels to make things move more smoothly. 4 people at a time will be asked to come up, and we will call on them one at a time. With that, our first panel is Ben Kallos, a council member, New York City Council. Betsy Gottbaum, Alex Camarada, and Morris Pearl. As is our custom, we will begin with the elected official. Mr. Councilman.
Good evening to the commissioners and members of the public who are here tonight. This is an amazing city with so much to do. The fact that you're here tonight and participating is what makes democracy work, where we see it failing in other places. I want to commend this commission for conducting an open and transparent process that included months of public meetings, debate, and deliberation. Thank you to the staff, and I see some of the brightest minds in New York City working on this commission for their diligence as shown by this detailed and comprehensive report outlining testimony and highlighting items for the commission. While government too rarely reflects the voices of those who speak out, it's great to see so many voices from all over the city reflected in the preliminary staff report. Now, New York City looks to you as commissioners to put the strongest recommendations on the ballot, recommendations that cannot get done through political process, and reset the foundation of this great city and create a democracy that empowers every voice in elections and governments. We've got 19 pages in our most recent submission. I want to just highlight the 3 must-do ballot initiatives. The first is get big money out of politics by matching every single public dollar. The second is term limits for community board members and leadership. And the third is giving binding land use powers for community boards and borough presidents so that if all are in agreement, they have the power to move forward with a rezoning or stop a rezoning. In addition, we came up with additional items that we supported in the report, including, of course, matching every dollar, lowering the dollars matched and increasing the multiplier. We withdrew previous recommendations and got behind some of the things we heard from other people in this great city. Lowering the contribution limits we support. We also wanted to suggest some new ideas based on your feedback, such as just not matching big dollar contributions anymore. A new one which is just eliminating war chests and killing all the zombie political committees. Empowering residents to run for office, we support by removing the arcane petitioning process. Love automatic registration and support that. We also wanted to suggest splitting out voter assistance from campaign finance efforts. Another important one that we're starting to see with the musical chairs between Albany and New York City would be lifetime term limits, such as they have in California. We support acting now. On the community board front, we support term limits for community board members, and whether it's a citizens union recommendation or a new one such as having 2 4-year terms staggered with elected officials who appoint them so that the elected officials don't have quite as much enforcement power over their appointments. Ending automatic reappointment, standardizing and making applications public, ensuring representations with automatic removal for non-attendance, and prohibiting the appointment of partisan party officials or lobbyists. And I see my time has expired.
Yes, that was...
Wrap up with the last 5, providing, as I mentioned earlier, binding land use power. Along with that, urban planners for every community board, especially those who might not think they need it. Having an Office of Community Planning like DCP, but that doesn't answer to the mayor, but answers only to the community boards. Having member training that is mandatory, that goes beyond COIV and what have you, which we support. And last but not least, where I disagreed with the suggestion that was considered by this commission, which is leaving the district boundaries alone, I don't think that the political boundaries that are drawn through a political process and subject to one person, one vote should be coterminous with our community board districts. I hope you'll enjoy. We've got
Thank you.
copies for folks.
Thank you. What we'll do is we'll hold our questions till we've heard from the entire panel, and then we'll begin our questioning. Ms. Gottbaum.
Good evening. My name is Betsy Gottbaum, and I am now Executive Director of Citizens Union, former New York City Public Advocate, and several other jobs before that. It's very nice of you all to do this and to... Can't hear you. Sorry. Very nice of all of you to do this, and I'm very impressed by the amount of support that the public has shown by coming tonight. I am only, unlike my colleague here, going to speak about one issue that is of great importance to me personally, and that's ranked choice voting. The committee of the Citizens Union, which is a committee made up of board members and our members, met and absolutely voted 100% to support ranked choice voting, which made me very pleased because I remember when I first ran for office, the primary day was September 11th, 2001. And as many of you, or many of us all remember, it was a very sad day, and the primary was denied or closed or whatever you call it. And on September 25th, we had a second primary, and that primary occurred, and nobody reached 40% of the vote. So then there was a runoff on October 11th, and the amount of time between September 25th and October 11th was worse than agonizing. It was agonizing because of what had happened to New York. It was terribly costly, not only for the city, but it was costly for the candidates. And the turnout was very, very low. And my understanding is that many people, particularly those who had absentee ballots, couldn't vote at all because there wasn't enough time, even though it seemed to me like it was a year, that terrible, terrible time. So I want to say that we, as an organization, are very, very much in favor of the ranked choice voting, or let's end the runoff system. Thank you.
Thank you for being brief.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Alex Camarda. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Reinvent Albany, and I'm here tonight to talk about redistricting, one of the 5 areas that was highlighted in the staff preliminary report. We were very pleased that redistricting is one of the 5 items being considered by the Commission, and we wanted to make several recommendations regarding redistricting reform. There are 2 major areas we think the Commission should tackle. The first is making the Districting Commission more independent, as the staff suggested in the report. But the second, we would urge you to also do, which is addressing the criteria by which council districts are drawn. The first, on making the Districting Commission more independent, we would suggest you look at the models in Arizona and California, which are often held out as being the best. Both of those models create an independent body to determine qualified applicants that politicians later winnow down into a smaller field that becomes the commission members. We think that's a good model, and we think you should examine that model closely. On the criteria, which was less discussed when you had experts come before the panel on redistricting, we think there are a number of things that need to be done that are very important. The first is narrowing the population deviation between the largest and smallest districts. It's currently 10% from the average district size. As you may know, congressional districts are drawn essentially equal in size in states all across the country. That's not true for state legislative districts. It should be. We think it should be as close to 0 as possible. There are other states that have a narrower population deviation than New York City. Colorado, Minnesota, Iowa are examples. We think there should be a provision that would ban drawing districts to favor or oppose any elected official, candidate, presumed candidate, or political party. That would prohibit the drawing of districts to preserve what are called continuities of previous districts, which is essentially a euphemism for protecting incumbents, but it's allowed by federal case law. We think a provision prohibiting drawing districts to favor elected officials, candidates, or political parties would negate the ability to do so. Lastly, we think that the prioritized criteria that currently exist in the charter should be resequenced. Currently, communities of interest is ranked higher than drawing districts that conform with geographic and political subdivisions, what Commissioner Cesare called coterminality. We think by reversing the prioritization, districts could be drawn that better adhere to neighborhoods and real communities rather than the very vague definition of community of interest in the charter. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak before you. I greatly appreciate all of the work that you're doing and all of your recommendations from the staff to improve the governance of the city. I represent the patriotic millionaires. My name is Morris Pearl. I represent a group of wealthy business people and investors who are concerned by the direction our democracy is going. Our democracy works best for all of us when everyone's able to fully participate in our political process. And we are extremely concerned about the influence of money and politics, and we believe our democracy needs all citizens to have the same access to political power as now enjoyed by our millionaires. New York City has made great strides since the 1980s, but the proposals in your preliminary staff report, specifically the proposal to increase the available match so as to allow matching funds up to the spending cap, would be a significant improvement. I'm here not because I want to help the candidates run for public office. They don't need more money. Elections are rarely won or lost for want of $100,000. But I'm here today because this proposal increased the engagement in our civic and economic life of our city. For those who donated $175 is a stretch, for those whom $2,000 out of the question, from $5,000 simply not possible. I want all those people to participate in politics regardless of their income levels. And I want the council representatives and their mayor to spend as much time listening to them as they've been listening to the chair of the Patriotic Millionaires. And spend time they do. I turn off my cell phone for the meeting, but I get so many calls requesting donations that I wonder when they actually have time to legislate. The problem is that even those lawmakers with the best of intentions learn what their constituents need by listening to their constituents. But our system makes them spend so much time listening to the big donors instead. The reality is that major donors have plenty of opportunities to make their concerns known without waiting in line by simply sitting around and waiting for the phone to ring. When money becomes speech and candidates spend their time fundraising from the small group of wealthy people, the voices of others are drowned out. Small donor matching systems like ours here in New York are extremely effective in empowering normal citizens to engage in the political process and to make their voices heard. The New York campaign finance system has done a great deal to shift power to the people and has literally changed the face of City Hall, or at least the faces inside City Hall. However, until a candidate can run with only small dollar contributions, the influence of big money in New York politics is still there. Your proposal to equalize the cap on expenditures and the total amount a candidate can receive from small donations plus matches is a huge step forward towards ensuring our politicians are accountable to the people and not to wealthy donors and corporations. For far too long, the influence of money in politics has distorted policy and rightfully diminished the public's trust in government. New York City has been a leader in this important issue, and it's time to lead again.
Thank you. I'm sure that applause is for all four of the members of the panel. Well, I will exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question. I'll ask the councilman. I don't think anybody can disagree with the idea of taking big money out of politics. Well, I suppose there are some people that do disagree, but what we are interested in at this point is to begin to get a sense of how much money we're talking about. What is too much? How much should the public match be? Have you had any thoughts about dollar amounts that might help us?
I think when you see four figures or more, it creates an appearance.
$1,000 or more? Is it?
I think that starts to create an appearance of impropriety. I think that lowering the contribution limits to 2,000 and 1,000 such that you can't give more to a local city council member than you can give to the president. But I think what's most important, and as Morris Pearl from Patriotic Millionaires really hit home, and I couldn't have said it better myself, is it's about incentivizing candidates to just take small dollars. I'm suggesting that you lower what is matched, not increasing it. So CFP would like you to increase it back to 250, which would be a step backwards. I'd say drop it to 100, match it 10 to 1, and just let people run on small dollars only. Yes, people could take big dollars if they wanted to, of 1,000 or 2,000 under the proposed change, but folks should just be running around talking to as many voters as possible or residents and saying, can you give me $100? It's matched 10 to 1. And then they wouldn't have to take any other big dollars. And another new proposal is just don't even match contributions above the 100 or 175 mark, because why are we incentivizing big dollars anyway? And at that point, you change it from, you might have some folks who are still running on big dollars, but at that point, you're actually penalizing people for taking big dollars, and they could just run around and spend their time saying, you know what, I'm going to, instead of just spending my time calling folks like Morris and asking millionaires for large checks of 5,000, spend their time running around their neighborhoods or their boroughs, getting house parties together and hearing for the types of people who give $10 or $50 or $100 or give $10 10 times.
Any of my commissioners ready for a question?
I have one. Betsy, I like the idea of the instant runoff, but have you guys envisioned how it would work? Do you have a concept, or is it more of a general statement of support of the
My point of view is more of a general statement.
Yeah.
But staff has looked at it very carefully, and we looked at other cities that have it, and there are some models there. I unfortunately don't know exactly what they are, but there are models, and I think we will suggest that going forward.
Great.
You know, the most persuasive argument to me has been this idea that some people, because of the short time between the original election and the runoff, many people don't get a chance to vote again. And we have a large number of absentee ballots that nobody uses, and they are truly disadvantaged. Do you think those people are the ones that are worse off in the system?
Well, as I said, I think the candidates are really badly off. That's a personal comment. But I do think the people that can't vote, I mean, because the time is so short. And also, I think a lot of people aren't paying attention. You've had one election, and then you turn around and wait a couple, and then you have another election, and people are just not interested. And to me, that's another real reason that the abysmal voter participation, which is bad anyway, but it's even worse for runoffs.
Wendy.
So it's two questions, they're similar. So one is for the council member with respect to the community board recommendations, and you had a whole lot of helpful recommendations. What are the changes of the ones you recommend that you think are the most important to improve the functioning of the community boards? And then for all the panelists, similarly, if there were sort of one or two tweaks you would make to the campaign finance system now, what do you think of, not to say that we're not contemplating all of them, we are, just I'm interested in the ones that you think are the most critical of those.
I think that term limits for community boards is something that I tried to get done in the city council. I co-sponsored an introduction by Councilmember Danny Drum as governmental operations chair. We had a hearing. It was very politically difficult to get it done, even with us pushing as hard as we could. I think it's something that this commission can and must put before the voters. They seem to like term limits, even when it might be politically difficult. And I think the other piece would be the perhaps most important is giving community boards actual binding power over land use, and just I understand, just back to the campaign finance piece, how much would doing a full public match be? 2013 had a lot of people running. I believe it cost $60 million. And that was for a 55% match. If we matched every single dollar at the current rate, that would increase the cost by about 30%, which comes out to another $18 million. and $78 million is a rounding error in our budget, and if you just attributed it as a cost of corruption or the appearance of corruption, some might argue that in Rivington the city lost $100 million. So like just avoiding the Rivingtons, or even the legal costs we spent on defending Rivington, I think were $4 million. Like we start to pay, it ends up paying for itself when you don't have the appearance or legal fees stemming from these investigations.
Let me just add that this commission is particularly concerned about the appearance of corruption, which is very strong, and we heard from many, many people who testified before us that that is something they are concerned with. Rachel?
Yeah, as I said, I think that making the full match equal to the spending cap is the primary thing I'm supporting, but I think that all of the recommendations in your report, frankly, I think are important too, particularly agreeing with your concern about the appearance of corruption.
So I'm interested in an argument that was made about ranked choice voting and the potential that it would create an incentive for politicians to campaign beyond their base and and for there to be a decline in negative voting, because for those who are seeking the number 2, number 3, it might actually improve our political discussion. I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts about whether that seems like another potential benefit for ranked choice voting.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Because
So there was a suggestion that ranked choice voting might create an incentive for candidates to campaign more broadly and to campaign beyond people who would be considered their natural supporters in order to increase the likelihood that they would succeed in the ranked choice voting system.
The answer to that would be if you have a candidate who is a particular community, and if you had ranked choice voting, that candidate would have to go out to other communities in order to meet as many people as would be possible. And I think that would happen with ranked choice voting. The other thing that I didn't say, and I apologize, was the cost of doing the runoff election is just phenomenal. I think that it was $13 million when the public advocate, the current public advocate, when she ran in a runoff. It was $13 million, which is twice the amount of the budget of the public advocate's office. Just a sly comment.
So I have a follow-up question to that, because I'm also intrigued, in part because of an efficiency improvement, which I think it can represent. One of the concerns that was raised was that the voter education that would be necessary to ensure that it was effective would be considerable. And I'm curious, from your collective perspectives, how you think that can be achieved, and if that is of concern to you.
So that people understand what ranked choice voting.
Yes.
My understanding is in places where it's been done, and I apologize for not having specifics for you, that it has not been a big deal. That the public really learns quickly and likes it, and that it has not been a problem. But I may be wrong.
New York voters are very smart, and they can understand instant runoff.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Reinvent Albany also supports instant runoff voting. There have been a number of places, a number of cities where it's been enacted, and they've done polling after the fact, and always found that high percentages of people understood what ranking candidates on the ballot was. And as far as voter education goes, we do have a voter assistance advisory committee that's budgeted within the CFB. They already spend over $2 million just on printing materials. I think most of that is voter education. So we have a built-in infrastructure that already does voter education. It just needs to be integrated within that, and probably some additional money spent. But to Ben's point, or the council member's point, this is a rounding error in an $86 billion budget.
I want to remind everyone that for almost 30 years we had elections with ranked choice voting. They were called school board elections, and I happened to run in one, and it's really not as complicated as it may sound. And I think I forgot who it was, I think it was you and Betsy, it does force you to build alliances and maybe not scream about your opponent as much as you would have, because you do want their second vote, you want their support. So.
Maine figured it out, part of Northern California figured it out, New York can do it.
I would just add that instituting ranked choice voting would actually cover the cost of a full public match. And
I knew you were thinking that, by the way.
Great minds think alike. And to leapfrog off the vice chair's question, I think that part of the education, even that there is an election, usually happens from the campaign when you call the voter and you say to the voter, hi, will you vote for me in this election? And they say, I didn't know there was a primary, I didn't know you had a primary. Sure, I'll go out and vote. And in that process, you'd also say, please make sure to vote for me, number one. And then if you have the unfortunate occurrence, which occasionally happens where the person says, absolutely not, I'm upset that you want to get big money out of politics, you can say, well, at least could I be your number two? And I think through that process, voters would be educated in addition to the Voter Assistance Commission and other.
This is a great panel. I just have one comment, and Alex, the reason people were fixated in 1989 about communities of interest had to do with minorities. They had been targeted for, they were disadvantaged by the line drawing, and so the term communities of interest was used as opposed to a racial or ethnic description. With that,
I was going to say, we're sensitive to that. I just think the definition of the charter is very vague, and it's been manipulated to protect incumbents, frankly, in the last round of redistricting. And so we would like to, at the very least, see the definition tightened so it actually applies to ethnic and racial groups and not any group that has a hobby or is united by some other purpose.
Right. Thank you.
I have a question actually following that.
Right.
So, Mr. Camarda, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how in the recommendation to ensure that the redistricting commission is independent, how would do you have a specific recommendation to ensure that the community's voices are heard in the process?
That's not something we closely focused on. I will say I think that process has actually gotten better over the years. There's much more use of technology. I mean, many of the things like this commission has done where the last commission utilized technology to a great deal, I think more so than any previous commission had done. It was something they did really well in terms of putting the maps online and things of that nature, going out into communities, holding many hearings. You know, we see the issues as being more of, at least the perception of how the commission members are chosen, being unduly influenced by elected officials who then have to run in the very districts that are drawn. And then the criteria, which, you know, are very loose, they're very vague, and often it allows the drawing of lines really in any fashion that they can be, that they want to draw the lines in. And I think too often in the past that has been done to protect incumbents' districts and make it easy for them to win again. We saw in the last districting commission that certain neighborhoods were divided, and the justification for that, I mean, the chair of the commission said it, was that they were taking into account what they called continuities of communities, which is essentially that previous district lines that were drawn should be continued, and that's justified legally under federal case law.
we're going to have to move on. I want to thank this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me The next panel is composed of Dave Schumack, Roxanne Delgado, Alida Camp, and Tara, can we read that? Is it Kezi or Tara? I'm sure you know your last name. Kelly. I don't know. Not well written. Anyway, we'll start on the left as we did last time and move across.
Thanks for having this panel. My name's Dave Schmau, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the Freedom Socialist Party in response to the preliminary staff report of the Charter Revision Commission. In particular, I'd like to address the concerns and proposals made regarding municipal elections and civic participation. The report refers to many responses calling for expanding involvement by New Yorkers in the political life of the city, and correctly concludes that greater engagement would enhance democracy. One of the proposals made at public hearings was to extend the right to vote for local candidates and issues to non-citizens. But the proposal in the preliminary report is that the commission not refer this measure to the electorate. We disagree. More than 1/5 of New Yorkers are deprived of the most fundamental democratic right to participate in social policy, the right to vote, because they are not citizens. Despite paying taxes, more than $18 billion statewide, despite their enormous contributions in producing goods and services that benefit all non-citizen residents, have no right to representation. The objections raised in the report that this measure would require the Board of Elections to maintain a separate list of municipal voters and to print a separate municipal ballot are minor in comparison to guaranteeing the essential civil right to all who reside in New York City. It is our view that this should include all residents regardless of immigration status. As the city's ID NYC program notes, all New Yorkers, particularly the most vulnerable, should have access to public resources. We believe this should include the right to vote and to participate in the civil and political life of their communities. Addressing this issue has been too long deferred. This Charter Revision Commission should recommend and refer to voters the proposal to amend the city charter to extend the right to all residents to vote in municipal elections. The report does propose several steps that would make voting more accessible, notably by addressing language barriers and easier registration, and also suggests institution of ranked choice, instant runoff voting, all of which would improve municipal elections. We urge that future deliberations address other means of lowering barriers to civic participation in the electoral process, including easing the requirements for signature collection that would make it more feasible for independent third parties to put forward candidates and for citizens to bring initiatives to the electorate. In addressing engagement with community boards, the report raised the concern that the boards
You will need to wrap up at this point.
often fail to represent the racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity of their communities and proposes the imposition of term limits to address this. We suggest that a more potent way to ensure that the boards reflect and represent the changing character of their districts would be to give those communities the right to elect community board members and to recall those who failed their constituents.
You really must wrap up at this point.
Rather than have these positions appointed. In conclusion, we urge the Commission to support the right of non-citizens to vote and to promote other means to expand the democratic process in New York City.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Ms. Delgado.
Hello. Hi. Hi. I'd like to make a quick comment, please, regarding the instant runoff regarding the rank file voting. I'm against it. Because right now, the Board of Election can't even handle its own election right now. They can't have more responsibility because I live in the Bronx and they can't even put the signs correctly. They open the wrong doors. They deny people who have disabilities to have access to the poll sites. We cannot add. I would say just eliminate the runoff system to save the money. Because I know the Board of Election, believe me. I have actually dealt with them and I can tell you they're a complete failure and there's no accountability. And also second, regarding giving more powers to community board, I'm against it too because first of all, I didn't elect them and most of them are out of touch and most of them are very uninformed. They're not trained, they're not informed on the issues and I did not elect them, so please don't give them more power because I just had an issue with Community Board 10 where they basically had the city council member hijack the meeting, preside over the meeting before the vote. They took the vote and closed the public testimony even before 6 people spoke, so I have an issue with community boards now. All right, so my main issue is, again, the campaign financing matching program. My issue is that currently with the system, we have incumbents or established picks being funded by CFB while their opponents are not financed because they were not qualified or they did not raise the minimum threshold money. My issue is that the CFB actually is eliminating competition because they're funding a race where there's no competition, where the incumbent or the established candidate has the money and they're publicly financed because they raised enough money, sufficient funds, but the other opponents couldn't raise the minimum requirement to be financed. And I gave you a whole bunch of spreadsheets showing the different races recently. One was Councilman Ben Callows. He received over $125,000 in matching funds, but his 3 other opponents combined didn't raise over $25,000 and couldn't qualify for matching funds. So this is the discrepancy, the inequality that I don't care for, because I feel like if you're going to continue financing or increasing the matching funds, make sure that there's equality between the haves and have-nots. Sorry, I get this. Well, I mean, I gave you all the spreadsheet, but it shows some, even the public advocates rate. She received over $250,000 public financing, and her three other opponents, both the Republican and the Green Party, they may raise $25,000 combined. How is that fair? And that's a waste of taxpayers' money. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hearing my testimony. My name is Alita Camp. I am Chair of Community Board 8 Manhattan. The board would like to respond to the preliminary staff report issued recently. The Charter Revision Initiative is complex and demands attention. There is quite a lot to consider. However, the close proximity of the release of the report to the release of proposed ballot items does not allow for sufficient community input. This time frame, coupled with no August community board meetings, make board consensus on responses difficult, if not impossible. This is particularly serious with respect to community board and land use proposals, two areas in which community boards have particular and obvious interest. I would like to offer the following comments on those parts of the report on which CB8 has already taken positions. I would like to comment on the question of board term limits based on my experience. CB8 has had a great deal of turnover from attrition and non-reappointment of members. For example, this year we have 9 new members, which is approximately 18% of the board. Last year, 5 new members were appointed. Together, approximately 1/4 of CB8 are new appointments. With attrition, we have new ideas and new voices. With members that have remained on the board, who must be hardworking or face not being reappointed, we have institutional memory and experience and guidance. CB8 supports additional financial and other resources to enable community boards to do their job properly. We support an urban planner for each community board, or, at the very least, no fewer than 1 urban planner dedicated to community boards per borough. CB8 recommends a stronger, more thorough, community-based land use planning process. We would like to see greater emphasis on community assessment of social and environmental factors in considering land use plans. We oppose REBNY's request for stronger as-of-right development. We are gravely concerned about the extent of development in our community and across New York. We further reject the attempt to displace the City Council in land use decisions and recommend that community boards determine whether land use will have an impact on respective communities. We further believe that the entire ULURP process should be transparent. Transparency would include a time limit on ULURP approvals and an evaluation of whether self-certification benefits New York. We urge the Commission to include a revision to provide for notification to community boards as soon as any land use applications, including as of right and commencement of the ULURP process, are filed. New York's great diversity of age, religion, culture, race, ethnicity, income, and occupation are what create the vitality that attracts businesses, tourists, and residents. We recommend a stronger role for community boards in land use planning and decisions. We are well situated to assess impact on the diversity and quality of life in our communities. The Landmarks Preservation Commission has the critical task of preserving New York's valuable history and architecture. We strongly urge the Commission not to diminish its power or transfer its role to another agency. CB8 urges the Charter Review Commission to continue to allow for a powerful role for community boards as the voice of New York's diverse local communities in, at the very least, land use and landmarks processes. We ask for an opportunity to respond to the campaign, the last sentence,
Okay.
finance reform and other issues after our September full board meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Tara Kelly speaking on behalf of the Municipal Art Society of New York. MAS was founded 4 years prior to the adoption of New York City's first charter in 1897. Throughout our long history of advocating for sound land use and planning policy, MAS has provided input on the various city charter revisions. From a historical perspective, we find many issues relevant over 100 years ago remain central to the city charter and its subsequent revisions today. As such, we offer the following comments and recommendations for the consideration of the Charter Revision Commission. For 125 years, MAS has worked to educate and inspire New Yorkers to engage in the betterment of our city. We believe the best advocates for the city are its citizens. Currently, there are several offices charged with supporting civic engagement of various types, but they are disparate and uncoordinated. As a result, one agency's efforts may proceed without considering relevant community comments and concerns that have been contemplated by another agency, process, or initiative. A citywide strategy to document, assemble, and communicate all of these efforts should be established in the Public Advocate's Office. New York's 59 community boards are critical to meeting the goals of civic engagement and must be truly representative of the citizens they serve. MAS agrees with proposals for a standardized application form and selection process overseen by the Public Advocate's Office, addressing discrepancies between community district and community board demographics. In addition, term limits allowing members to serve a reasonable number of consecutive terms, followed by an absence and reapplication process, should be implemented. However, we disagree with the proposal for mayoral or business-led appointments of members because it will skew the balance of the interests away from the public. In order for each community board to be successful, operational budgets should be increased and staffing required to include a district manager, full-time planner, and support staff. Board members should be required to attend an annual standardized training on the fundamentals of city government and land use planning in New York City. Community boards also need funding to increase public awareness of meetings through enhanced outreach in a variety of platforms and languages. The provision of childcare, interpretation, and refreshments may further reduce barriers to participation. The creation of a uniform online platform for all community boards should increase transparency and perhaps facilitate virtual participation. We were disappointed to find out that land use was an area deferred to future consideration and not comprehensively addressed by this commission. Nonetheless, we offer testimony on this important topic in our written statement to be submitted for your review. In sum, improving the ability of communities to advocate for a more livable city has been part of the mission of MAS for decades. We believe that the integration and availability of civic engagement information, the structure and prominence of the community board, and the determination of districts is integral to achieving that goal. As development pressures mount and communities are faced with long-term impacts of the city's land use decisions, charter revision comes at a critical time for New York. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask my fellow commissioners if they have questions, I just need to make a comment about the first two speakers. We heard a great deal about the failures of the Board of Elections, as you pointed out. It was rather consistent, and that is one of the concerns we have when we hear people advocating for non-citizen voting. We're living in a climate in which if an individual were mistakenly to find themselves casting a ballot that was not just a municipal one, but for some other office, and it can happen, we would not be surprised if the federal government were to suddenly have people monitoring each of our polling places. So it's for that reason, not that there has been some hesitancy about embracing non-citizen voting. With that, who wants to start the questioning? Dale, go ahead.
This is a question for Mr. Schmalk. I hope did I say that right?
That's very good. If and when I decide to run for city council, I might abbreviate it or change it.
Okay.
Make it a little more pronounceable.
This question is, I hope you take it, it's a sympathetic question, because I'm sympathetic to the view that everyone who has a stake in their local government should have a say in that local government. But as our chair identified, there are some logistical, practical concerns here, which I know you made reference to in your testimony. But separate and apart from those logistical, practical concerns, there's also a legal question about whether or not the city has the authority to set qualifications for voting for city offices that are different from the qualifications set forth by state statute. And I don't expect you to have an answer today. If you do, that's great. But if you
don't know the state law from top to bottom, however, I do know that we are here today because law is always on a continuum. We are revisiting it constantly for different reasons. Different forces are in play, looking to do different things. And I would remind you, if you don't already know, that non-citizen voting was part of New York City's history up until the late 20s when it was done away with for the most part. But it's not unknown, and it can, if there is the will, it can be instituted again.
What I was getting at was what I think would be helpful for at least, I can't speak on behalf of everyone else up here, but for me, is if you know of someone who could perform some sort of legal analysis of the city's authority to set qualifications for voting for city offices that are different from state the qualifications set forth by state statute and submit that for the record, it's something that I know I would appreciate taking a look at.
Okay, I'll see if we can do that.
Anyone else? I just want to make one comment having to do with campaign finance reform. We are very seriously looking at changing the way campaigns in New York are financed. I don't know if it'll meet all of your goals, but I do think that at the end of the day, you will see a significant effort to make it easier for the poor to make substantial contributions. And what's always on my mind is to do away with this sense that there is great corruption in our system, that if you give somebody a few $1,000s, you're definitely going to have an interest, and that elected official is going to be responding to you. So we're very well aware of the problems that exist in our current system of campaign financing.
Well, quickly, there's a lot of corruption in the community boards now because, like I said, in the last month's meeting, it was unbelievable. They're just an extension of the political arm, and they will sell out for a free photo op with a politician or free lunch. It's disgusting. So eliminate committee boards.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Respectfully disagree.
Yes, of course. We've heard all four of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next panel, Joseph Lally, Lynn Ellsworth, Kelly Grace, is that Pike? What is it? Price. And Ken Coughlin.
I could go in the next panel.
Very nice. Allison Greenburg. So she just got her food.
Who's the, what's your name that just got? Kelly, okay. And it's Allison, correct?
Yes, thank you.
Shall we begin?
My name is Joseph Lally. I wanted to first respond to Ms. Greenberger's comment about whether ranked choice voting would be confusing. It's a question that's brought up many times. Of course, because it's a different system, it would require education, but I don't believe it would be a problem because it's used in so many places: San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Aspen, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Santa Fe, state of Maine. Overseas it's been used in Australia for centuries. New Zealand, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Iceland. London uses it for its mayoral election. In fact, the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences uses it to pick the Oscar for Best Picture. So it has a track record, and surveys have shown that voters are happy with it. So with some effort of education, I don't believe it would be a problem. So I like to make a point about possibly establishing an Office of Civic Engagement. Now, we all know that without engagement of the citizens, we have a democracy in name only, right? So there's nothing more important than engagement. Of course, the devil is always in the details, so it would be a question of what exactly is this office going to do. So I have a couple of ideas. I noticed that in New York City, we don't have a written voter's guide for non-municipal races. I find that really astounding, that no one sends out a written voter guide. The Campaign Finance Board has a written voter guide for municipal races, and they have an online guide for all the other races, but no one else sends out a printed. So I'm thinking maybe if we had an Office of Civic Engagement, they would have the budget and manpower to send out a printed copy, because it's nothing like having a copy in front of you coming in your mailbox. I think it would be a good idea. Also, possibly an Office of Civic Engagement could have an opt-in mailing list for people who want to come to meetings. For instance, I got no notice about this meeting. I found out about this meeting through
an email list of a council member. I don't even live in his district, and he had something. So that's how I found out about this meeting. So maybe it would be a good idea if the Office of Civic Engagement could, create some kind of database where people, if they wanted to, could opt in. Also, perhaps such an office could provide guidance and help for people who want to run for offices, to run for public office for the first time. That might be a possible role for them as well. And also, we could expand participatory budgeting, perhaps under the auspices of an Office of Civic Engagement. I don't know if that's possible. Could also move in New York City service under the umbrella. There's a lot of ways to go, of course. This is just some of the thoughts I have off the top of my head. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Lynn Ellsworth. I'm chair of Human Scale NYC. It's a nonprofit that seeks neighborhood livability, democratic control over the built environment, and human scale urbanism. We have longer testimony prepared with examples of conflicts of interest on community boards taken from Manhattan, and discussion of pros and cons of the reforms that we suggest. So I'll read here just an excerpt from that. We have read the online testimony about community boards given to this commission and the commission's own interim report, and agree with many who say that reform of community boards is badly needed and that the ULURP process needs improvement. But none of the proposed reforms that we've heard about so far, such as giving every board a city planner to work with, or giving boards more training, or some money to do community plans, will solve the underlying problems that create what one council member, Reynoso, has called the political cesspool of community boards. Giving unelected appointed boards more resources of any kind would only delegitimize them more and infuriate the electorate. What's needed is the comprehensive approach of 4 separate reforms that legitimize the boards and provide them with effective purpose. The reforms would be term limits. A second one would be imposition of a broader conflict of interest rule that precludes appointment or election to the board for anyone who represents special interests or who have obvious divided loyalties over policy issues. An example, for example, would be a vice president for governmental affairs of the Real Estate Board of New York co-chairing a land use committee in a Manhattan community board, as is now the case. We should also have election of community boards, and the pros and cons and the different debate about that are submitted in our separate testimony. We should also revamp the roles and powers of elected boards with one eye to the principle of subsidiarity in the regulation of public space, and the other eye on checks that assure that a citywide public interest is accounted for. We would not be supportive of having even elected community boards having 100% authority over land use. And let elected boards hire and fire their own independent planners, land use lawyers, and district managers. And as to reform of the ULURP process, we suggest that as soon as city planning has a glimmer of an idea about a land use action, they should be required to issue a one-page notification of intent to change zoning in neighborhood X, which should define in the widest possible terms the geographic area of interest to city planning. And this notification should be public and should trigger a real estate speculation tax or a flip tax in the affected area until the land use changes are approved or abandoned. They should also be required to publicize on their website on a monthly basis a list of all the real estate developers and property owners who have meetings with city planning staff, including the subject of those meetings and the geographic area discussed. Our expanded testimony is with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your public service for our city. My name is Allison Greenburg. I'm a villager, and I'm testifying on behalf of Human Scale NYC. This testimony was written by Lynn Ellsworth, sitting to my right, and she's done a lot of work on these issues. We have read the testimony given thus far about campaign finance reform and wish to add to the discussion the following. First, the point of modifying the Campaign Finance Act should be to make New York's middle class the dominant force behind the system, not the upper middle class and the wealthy. That would mean, 1, lower the maximum contribution overall to an amount that is within reach of the middle class. We suggest the ancient rule of tithing. Take 10% of the median income of New Yorkers That figure would come out to a maximum contribution of $560. To compensate for the reduced total take of the system, raise the public matching ratio from 6-to-1 to 12-to-1 or even 15-to-1. Second, dramatically lower the spending maxes to reduce the spectacle of public waste of TV ads, printed mass mailings, and the hiring of campaign consultants, none of which is necessary in this day and age. 3, dramatically reduce the number of signatories required to get on the ballot for any office. The current system is utterly unnecessary and induces an unsavory Tammany Hall-like dependence on political clubs. 4, the candidates that do not partake in the public finance system do not allow them to participate in publicly televised debates, but encourage them to finance their own debates. 5, short of adopting a fully financed public system like Seattle's, this would have the advantage of eliminating a large part of the inherent pay-to-play system that currently exists. And our second general point, if these dramatic reductions are not feasible, then we urge the city to eliminate 3 specific loopholes in the act that appear designed to allow real estate developers to get around the doing business with the city campaign contribution limit of $400. We thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coughlin.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Ken Coughlin. I've been a member of a Manhattan Community Board for the past 9.5 years. The opinions expressed here are mine and not those of my board. Community board members serve at the pleasure of their borough president. Although members must be reappointed every 2 years, there is no limit on how many terms a member can serve, and it is not unusual for members to have served on a board for literally decades. The solution to these lengthy terms is term limits, an idea that certainly involves trade-offs. On the one hand, long-serving members add expertise and institutional memory to a board. But on the other, members who have been sitting on a board for decades can espouse outdated values that no longer reflect those of their community. Communities change, but all too often their boards lag behind that change. And this has real and sometimes life or death consequences. Although community boards are supposed to play only an advisory role, in reality, some city agencies treat their voices as a proxy for the community at large and defer to their wishes. Thus, these entrenched bodies can yield enormous power over proposed changes. Some form of reasonable term limits could preserve continuity while ensuring that fresh faces reflecting a changing community and values. One proposal put forward would set a 12-year term limit, but allow limited members to apply after a year off the board. A related concern is the lack of standardization in the appointment process. Community board appointments were historically about whom you knew. When he was Manhattan Borough President, Scott Stringer instituted a system in which applications were reviewed and evaluated by an independent screening panel, with finalists interviewed by staff. Borough President Gail Brewer has continued this reform. A transparent, merit-based process should be in place in all 5 boroughs. Thank you.
Thank you. Deb?
This question's for Ms. Ellsworth. Can you talk about how broadly or how narrowly you're defining special interest when you say that community boards should not include people who represent special interests? So I'm curious to hear more about what you mean by that.
Well, in our survey, we did a quick look at Manhattan community boards, and I can't say we went through every single member of every single board, but we find people who are professional lobbyists for special interests, such as the hotel and hospitality industry, working on licensing committees. You know, they're very concerned about liquor licenses and sidewalk tables. And if a board member is a professional paid lobbyist, they have a conflict in the sense that they serve one master, and how can they also serve the public? And I think even the board person would see certain problems. There are other categories of members, like people who are in the senior executive teams of political clubs or unions. I would put them in the same category in the sense that, you know, they have a loyalty to If you're a political club leader, you've endorsed certain candidates, you've taken certain positions, you seek access, you have an agenda, and you bring that to the community board as well. And everyone in the neighborhood knows that. Same with unions. It's not that an ordinary union member couldn't serve. It's like, but if you're on the leadership team, you have a conflict, and it's an institutionalized conflict.
Wendy?
A quick follow-up question about that. Would recusal requirements for participating in decisions that relate to the subject of your conflict address that, or do you think, and if not, why not?
No, I think that recusal is meant philosophically, I think, to handle a situation where you have an immediate financial concern. You know, your brother-in-law owns the construction business that is up for a bid, and you don't want to step away. But if you're a professional lobbyist for the Real Estate Board of New York, you know, you're on the board, you're on the chair, you're influencing tons of decisions, you're influencing the agenda, you're choosing who gets to do what work. There's endless small items that you kind of think, well, how can that person possibly, you know, who's his master? So recusing, it doesn't really help the public have credibility, to believe that there's honesty in the game, put it that way.
I just want to make a comment. I think the fact that someone happens to work in the real estate industry, so I happen to work in an industry that is building the places that we all live in, we shop at, we get on a subway, we drive our cars on roads, our children go to schools, we go to hospitals, we build educational complexes such as NYU. So it sounds like in your logic, all those people should not be on a community board because they are influenced by some other master. And I will take an opportunity to say that people who work in real estate are not bad people. People who happen to work for a union and are in leadership are not bad people. And by the way, there are good people and bad people in everything. So I would caution you not to lump all people in one category just because they work in one industry.
Sure.
I'm sorry, but she didn't do that.
I don't lump
That's
them
not
all
fair.
together, and I understand that. You know, everybody, you know, I'm an economist, and, you know, I think in certain fields of work, if I was called to public service, it would be hard to, like, not have professional loyalty to my profession, like I owe them, but in other areas of work, I can operate in the public interest. And I think it's the same, if you were chair of my land use committee, I might have some concerns. If you were chair of my local social service committee on my community board, I might not be so worried about you.
May I respond to the comment? Because I just don't think it was fair to characterize Ms. Ellsworth's testimony as lumping anyone as good or bad. Instead, she was expressing sincere concerns that we have, and we think very highly of plenty of people in real estate and who are on unions. The issue is when somebody has a leadership position in certain realms that are very powerful, how can they possibly not control the outcome of a community board decision, city council vote? That's what we're very concerned about as citizens of New York.
Sure. Anyone else have comments? With that, let me thank the four of you. Kelly? Tawaki Komatsu? Jacobs is the last name. I'm having trouble reading the... Adam, yes, that's what it says. And John Day. Mr. Day? Why don't we start with you, Kelly?
Hi, thank you so much, Chair Perales. I go by Grace, if you don't mind. My middle name was my grandmother's name. And I'd like to thank you for allowing me to testify today. I'm Kelly Grace Price with the Jails Action Coalition and with Close Rosies. I'm sorry to admit that I've not been participating in these commission review panels, and I haven't had the opportunity to submit my suggestions So my comments today might seem like a bit of a non sequitur because they have nothing to do with your report or what other people have already discussed. I'm going to specifically discuss rape and sexual assault investigations in all of our city agencies. I personally do advocacy with the Board of Correction and the Department of Correction. My specific advocacy plank for the better part of the last decade has been to end rape on Rikers Island. People say, oh, well, rape happens in prisons and jails. But in our city, we have the most abysmal substantiation and closure rate for rape and sexual assault of any jail complex in the country. We literally have a 0% closure rate. This is mimicked when we talk about investigations against police officers and corrections officers. Those specific investigations, the closure rate is far below the national average. I would like to specifically propose that the Charter Revision Committee seriously considers creating a new entity that serves sort of like Mark Peters' DOI, Department of Investigation, and is an overarching investigative body that has the ability to investigate rape and sexual assault against any city agent, employee, agency, official, subcontractor, consultant, etc. Right now, we have this problem raging in 4 of our city agencies, well, actually all of our city agencies, but most acutely in the NYPD and the Department of Correction. In March, Mark Peters' Department of Investigation released a very long 90-page report about the abysmal methodology and substantiation rate of rape and sexual assault cases within the NYPD SVU. That report mimicked a very similar report, a community report that was issued in 2012. The NYPD, and I did turn in my comments, written comments via email, so please know that all these things have hyperlinks to news articles and different board reports issued by city agencies so that all of my comments, in fact, are verified. But we had a report issued that basically mimicked the exact same findings of 2012. The NYPD is literally just ignoring the community. The same thing with the Department of Correction. Now, the most sacrosanct offering that our government can give us is our safety. And as women, people that are trying to live our lives sexual assault free, this goal has been completely obfuscated by our city agencies. I'd like to encourage you to please take the time to read my short written testimony. It is detailed, but I think it's worth taking a look at. This is an issue that no one's talking about outside of the confines of the Downstate Coalition Against Sexual Violence, and I'd really like this to be a part of the charter revision.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Tawaki Komatsu. I've testified repeatedly at city council meetings, and I have a federal lawsuit filed against the city of New York, as well as a New York State Supreme Court lawsuit filed against the city agency. The basis for those lawsuits is I had a conversation with the mayor on July 18th of last year. You have section 1063 in the New York City Charter that says that after a public hearing, a video is supposed to be released within 3 days thereafter. So the question is, instead of me, I guess, rehashing what I said to the mayor on July 18th, why don't I just play the video for you? No. So here's the image.
How long is the video?
It's short.
So, just as you did with Wells Fargo, can you commit to terminating New York City's business with that same company? What's the name of the company? NTT Data? I'm not familiar with that. You're looking at a settlement agreement. That may be true. I'm just not familiar with the company. I said about an hour ago that I would look into it and see if we can find out. We'll do what he says. And can he work to try to resolve this litigation I have against his agency for not doing what it's supposed to do? That's an issue for the law department, I think. And once there's litigation, the law department makes decisions about how to handle it. Have a lot of litigation, that's how we do things. And I guess, well, just one final question. You started dominating time. Yeah. But your head of security, Howard Redmond, he kept me out of your April 27th town hall in violation of New York State's open meetings law. But he's also a defendant in a separate civil rights lawsuit. I'm not familiar with that. That's not going to get a day.
So, sorry. So just to wrap up, all of you are under to this commission by the mayor, correct? So
Yes.
essentially, there's no legitimacy behind the election. If I was a whistleblower,
Which election?
the 2017 mayoral election, if I was a whistleblower trying to attend the mayor's public town hall meetings, public resource fair meetings, New York State has an open meetings law. There's also a federal statute of 18 U.S.C. 245 that whereby I can exercise my First Amendment right lawfully to, just like this Nitro federal lawsuit, to walk through the doors lawfully and say, you know what, I know about these problems with the New York City Human Resources Administration. They're being covered up by Stephen Banks. I had 15 punches connected.
To the microphone? I
Sorry.
want to hear everything you say.
I had 15 punches connected to my left temple on July 2nd of 2016, only because of the fact HRA did absolutely nothing about whistleblower reports I submitted to HRA on March 16th of 2016. I've had conversations with Mr. Carrion over there repeatedly, and they've come to no avail. So essentially, if other people continue to be harmed due to fraud, negligence, bait and switch, fraud by HRA's business partners, and there's no oversight, there's no corrective action being taken, people like me have to walk into the federal court to file a civil rights action. And I should also point out, in closing, I tried testifying at a public at a public hearing with the mayor on November 27th of 2017. On that same date, the plaintiff's attorney filed papers against the mayor's head of security. So basically, I found out Lieutenant Nieves of the mayor's security detail, he told me in a video recording that I recorded that Inspector Howard Redmond made the decision to keep me out of that public hearing on November 27th. So I guess the point I'm driving at is, if we're all here tonight for you to consider recommendations, for you to consider feedback, again, if there's no legitimacy behind the results of the 2017 mayoral election due to acts of voter fraud, voter suppression, why are we having this meeting?
Why don't I move along as we have in the others? The purpose of this meeting is to consider changes to the New York City Charter. I'm not sure I understand your point.
The point I'm driving at is all of you were appointed by the New York City Mayor, Bill
That's great.
If the manner in which he prevailed in that election was by suppressing whistleblowers who tried to essentially engage in whistleblowing at those public meetings that he uses as campaign events, that's voter suppression, that's voter fraud, and the outcome of the 2017 mayoral election is essentially null and void.
All right, well, that's an interesting point. I've answered your question.
Hi.
Next.
Thank you, Commission. My name is Adam Jacobs, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I am a resident of Community Board 6, and I am here to discuss the issue of lobbying and conflicts of interest within New York City. Just to step back for a minute on Lynn Ellsworth's testimony, within the charter of Chapter 68, I believe, of this commission, advisory opinion 95-18 does outline laws that do not allow lobbyists or people of interest to actually chair committees. So now we need to stretch that to actually other people throughout the committee, or throughout the community board. But there is actually, within your existing charter, advisory opinion 95.18 that I think all of you should know. So from a standpoint of lobbying, just from a quick review here, from a historical standpoint, I think we all feel that lobbyists were a way for elected officials to become educated about an issue. Their role had value, and again, it was an opportunity for them to hear all sides of an issue. Unfortunately, in a regulated democratic system, that works very well. So it is obvious to everybody here, and I think to a lot of people throughout New York City and throughout the country, that this system is now totally broken. Within the current system, it appears right now that there seems to be a quid pro quo going on between lobbyists and elected officials. Basically, the system is now set up that you help me get my project passed, and the people that are paying me will donate for your re-election. This goes on all the time and is absolutely disgusting. So again, ultimately, if you don't play along, then ultimately those people who are paying for the lobbyists will not fund your candidate, and ultimately that candidate will or that elected official will leave. This is a sort of roundabout way of getting around campaign finance reform, but again, lobbying issues need to ultimately be addressed. So what actually are these lobbyists getting from our elected officials? What does $20,000 buy you, $40,000? Why is Gail Brewer continually being involved in real estate projects? Is it access? Is it pressure? Is it her vote? Nobody really seems to know, but what is it that actually the Manhattan Borough President gets from the lobbyist? This money is basically eliminating the citizens from being part of the process because they can't come up with $40,000 or $60,000. And again, they don't get the same things that other people get. Again, ultimately, this goes on from a federal level, state level. Our mayor has been involved in a pay-for-play slush fund from the beginning of his, ultimately he was elected, to again, community board members, to ultimately we filed actually a complaint, a conflict of interest to the COIB board, and now actually there's an investigation undergoing of a lobbyist on one of our community boards ongoing right now from that standpoint. So at this time, basically again, just from the standpoint of this new charter, I'd like the members to address some of these issues. So
Now,
what I'm asking for is again is limits.
Can you sum up?
Yeah, very quickly. Limits on the amount of lobbying allowed for elected officials. It shouldn't be a casino game. There should be limits. Whatever is provided to the lobbyists should be provided to the public for free. It's our taxpayer money. They shouldn't get access and we don't. It should be specific and total transparency. Not just listing them as a target, but what are they actually asking for? Okay, and should be written down. And then again, number 4, the public should be made aware of the voting records of their elected officials. There should be actually a percentage or actually a rule, a listing of where we can find out how they're voting.
You really got to sum up.
Okay, and last point is no lobbyists at this point should be allowed on community boards, good, bad, or whatever. And again, Rule 95-18 should be expanded and looked at again to make sure that there really is not a conflict.
Thank you very much. Mr. Day?
Hi, John Day. I'm with Save Central Park NYC and a resident of Community Board 7. The concerns I want to express are about the advance of super tall buildings into residential neighborhoods. It's been a huge problem in Brooklyn. I think Councilman Callis spoke about one solution in binding land use by community boards. There's a broad perception among citizens in this city that the fix is in. I personally think we have very fine civil servants, but the concern is money from major real estate developers, some of whom are principled, others of whom may have even made it to the White House. So transparency is an issue. I think the BSA, the Department of Buildings, city planning, particularly the sale and purchase of development and air rights. It's extremely hard to find that information. Transparency in how it's filed, how it's available to citizens, to community boards is very important. So I'll keep it short. Thank you.
Let me just say, again, as I've said before, this whole issue of corruption and the appearance of corruption comes up all of the time. We are certainly sensitive to that, and we're going to see how it is that we can address it from our limited roles as people who are looking to revise the existing city charter. Any other commissioners have comments?
So what is your fix? I know the appearance is bad, but what is your fix?
Well, one of the things we are looking at, we don't have an immediate fix that we're going to tell you now, but we're looking at campaign finance reform. That's the obvious opportunity that we have within the city charter.
And what about the concern with lobbyists being infiltrated in our system?
We will be looking at all of that.
Great.
Thank you.
Wait.
Can I ask a question? Excuse me. I am particularly interested in this question of civic engagement and what are the mechanisms that can promote better civic engagement. And if you will indulge me for a moment, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask everybody here, if you could just by a show of hands, let me know whether or not you use any of the following existing mechanisms. 311, and if you do, if you could just put your hands up. NYC.gov, Mayor's Management Report, and Notify NYC. Okay, that's helpful. It's just an interesting look into thinking about what are the mechanisms and tools that we may be able to use. Thank you very much.
Next panel, Angela Connors, Hal Phillips, Caitlin Shearer, and Sheila Kendrick. Let's start on my left, your right.
Greetings, Commissioners. My name is Angela Connors, and I am a member of the Campaign for an Elected Civilian Review Board. Our campaign has written a charter amendment for an elected civilian review board and an independent special prosecutor. Our amendment is simple. It makes our current appointed board elected and then empowers that elected board to make binding decisions. In addition to a review board, in addition to a review board for police officers who are accused of crimes, our charter amendment establishes an independent special prosecutor's office whose sole duty is to investigate and prosecute those cases. This solves the conflict of interest that's inherent when the DA's office takes up cases involving their coworkers, the police. We appreciate that this commission staff took the time to hear our testimony on May 9th and include an analysis of our proposed amendment for an elected review board in the 2018 preliminary staff report. However, we are disheartened to hear that this commission intends to push off any responsibility to address the serious crisis of police accountability, citing an unwillingness to take on the careful analysis and public input under time constraints. The ongoing problem of police accountability in this city will not stop until leaders are willing to take a stand and support an empowered mechanism to hold police accountability for the violent crimes committed against those they were sworn to protect and serve. The current Civilian Complaint Review Board is highly ineffective and upholds a major conflict of interest by allowing the police commissioner ultimate authority over decisions. Therefore, ultimately, the police themselves at any discipline is watered down and families are forced to wait for justice, which seems to never come, as in the case of Eric Garner. Once again, our campaign calls upon this commission to stand up for New Yorkers, especially marginalized New Yorkers, by proposing changes that protect the people of New York against unabated police misconduct and violence. A review of the city charter without addressing the accountability crisis, we believe, is an incomplete review. We plan on bringing our amendment to the City Council convened Charter Commission because New Yorkers shouldn't have to wait for justice. We desperately need reform to hold police accountable.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for hearing my testimony. My name is Hal Phillips. I'm here in support of ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting. I know the commission has already heard a number of compelling arguments in favor of this, so in the interest of hopefully giving you something you haven't heard already, I wanted to very briefly share with you just a little bit of research I did into some recent election results. I looked up the results for city council primaries in 2017 and 2013 that had 3 or more candidates, meaning if we had had instant runoff voting, it would have been used in these elections. And as I'm sure you know, primary elections tend to be more competitive than general elections. So what I wanted to see with this was how low the threshold is for the percentage of the vote in order for someone to actually be considered elected. What I found is that in 2017 and 2013, we had 40 city council primaries with 3 or more candidates, and of those 40, 30 were won by a candidate who received under 50% of the vote. 12 of those 40 were won by a candidate who received under 40% of the vote, and 3 of those 40 primaries were actually won by a candidate who received under 30% of the vote. The lowest winning percentage was 24.4%, which means that in that election, over 3/4 of the voters did not vote for the person who was ultimately deemed the winner. Now, with no disrespect intended toward any of the winning candidates, this seems obviously and shockingly anti-democratic. We have elected officials in office today who were voted against by an overwhelming majority of the people that voted, but were still deemed elected. That seems like a clearly broken system, and I'm concerned that we could have a repeat of this in 2021 because we have term limits, so we're going to have dozens of open seats, which means a high potential for more competitive multi-candidate races in which there could be more split votes and more people getting only about 1/3 of the vote and still winning. And I'm concerned if we don't change this now, this is, 24.4 is not as low as it's going to get. We all saw a very high-profile example of what can happen when a multi-candidate field with no strong frontrunner can let somebody without majority support win via plurality in the 2016 Republican presidential nominating process. That's been happening in New York City for years, and it's getting worse. And I really hope that we change this before the 2021 primaries because I don't want my next city council member to get 24% of the vote and still win. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Caitlin Scher. I'm a volunteer member of the New York chapter of Represent Us. We're an anti-corruption organization in the city. I am also here speaking in support of ranked choice voting, and congratulations, that was a wonderful point that you just made much more passionately than I will be able to make here in my short time. We all know that we have a voter engagement problem in this country and in this city. New York State is below average in voter turnout, as referenced in the preliminary staff report. We ranked 14th from the bottom nationwide in casting ballots in the presidential election in 2016. In most general elections for mayor or governor, only 25% of registered New Yorkers go to the polls. And turnout for primary elections is even lower, with only 12% of eligible voters turning out for the mayoral primary in 2017. So there are many reasons for this disengagement. Among them is a perceived disconnection between a candidate's platform and its impact on voters' lives, as well as a general political apathy caused by a growing mistrust in our institutions. Instead of seeing, our world is growing ever more complex and nuanced, yet American politics appears to be retreating into a polarized two-party system. Instead of seeing themselves represented by individual candidates with distinct views, voters often only see a candidate's party. Constituents subsequently turn to defensive least worst option voting instead of voting on the actual issues or for candidates in which they actually believe in. I do believe that ranked choice voting could offer some solutions to this problem. Ranked choice voting enables voters to weigh in on more candidates when they're voting. It gives voters the opportunity to rank candidates in order of preference, allowing them to consider candidates who may not be frontrunners or from a major party. This in turn encourages a greater and more diverse field of candidates to run, shaking up the two-party system. Ranked choice voting also avoids split votes and victories for unpopular candidates. It seems completely unreasonable in a modern democratic society that the issues that you just expressed are occurring. With ranked choice voting, votes will not be wasted on such candidates, but rather redistributed to a voter's next intended choice, which makes elections more fair. Lastly, ranked choice voting eliminates expensive and unnecessary runoff elections. In New York City, if no candidate receives 40% of the vote in a primary, a runoff election must be held. Beyond the fiscal concerns that were also voiced already earlier involved in holding a second election, voters are required to, again, wake up early, use their lunch break, or pay a babysitter to watch their children or to do their civic duty, which they already did once. So it's hard enough to get voters to the voting booth once, and implementing ranked choice voting would allow them to voice their full opinion in a single election. I spend my hours calling council members and advocating on issues like ranked choice voting because I believe that campaign and electoral reform are at the, election reform are at the root of improving the democratic process. I want New York City to continue to be one of the best cities in the world. We have established some of the most progressive campaign finance laws in the country. We should be leaders in the state and the nation in forwarding democratic reforms such as ranked choice voting.
Thank you.
I'm Sheila Kendrick from Save Central Park, NYC. And I would like to encourage you to look at some of the land use things that have come up recently, and I know you are going to. The one thing that is of much concern, and it was brought to the mayor's attention in a town hall last January, is the loopholes that developers are utilizing to build super dolls. And going down the street today, it's every block, there's another crane. So the time is now. There's a real urgency for you all to look at the land use abuses. I think some of the frustration with voters is that we know that there's zoning laws that are there to protect us, but when you look at these towers going up in residential neighborhoods, and you know there are protections in place, whether it's landmarks or special districts or a ceiling cap that should pertain, and it doesn't, I think voters sit there and go, it doesn't matter what I do, because it doesn't matter what the laws are, it doesn't matter what the zoning resolution states. The abuses just go on and on because some people have the power and some people don't. And Community Board 7 recently passed a resolution addressing 5 of the most egregious loopholes that are being used. People like Gail Brewer and Ben Kalos have stood up and run overdevelopment forums to draw attention to this issue. And in the meantime, the cranes continue to go up and towers are going to be built around Central Park, and more of them are going up in residential neighborhoods. And we're all going to feel the loss of the most democratic space when it's covered in shadow. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon?
I have a question on the ranked choice voting. One of the things that has come up is whether or not we should be implementing this on a citywide, on all elections, on just citywide elections. Do you have strong feelings about whether there's any benefit to implementing first on a citywide election basis and then moving to city council members, or would you suggest that we go all in?
Personally, I'm in favor of using it for all municipal elections, primary and general, citywide and city council and borough-wide. I know that there's been more momentum for using it for just citywide primaries to replace the current runoff system. That certainly is far from my preference, but if that were what came up, I'd support that as a baby step in the right direction. I would hope that that would sort of acclimate voters and help make this more popular so that we could then implement it further down the road. But if it were up to me, I really see no reason not to use it in every election. I think the benefits do apply across the board. Really, the only additional benefit of using it to replace our current runoffs is the cost savings.
And I would agree with that. I also, in terms of, we were talking earlier about the confusion. Is there a potential confusion for constituents when they go to the voter booth? And I think that it should apply to all elections in order to keep some semblance of consistency. And I think that we're already, potentially facing a difference in terms of, within the staff report, it did go into, state versus local, or state versus city, and how that might be broken up, and that will, so for state elections, we would have a different system, the current system that we have, versus ranked choice voting for our city elections. So I think that in order to keep it as consistent as possible, it should be all at once and consistent.
Dale?
Just a couple questions about the CCRB. So just to see if I understand your proposals correctly, and forgive me if I have this wrong, it sounds like there are 2 separate proposals here. One that would change the way that the CCRB is, the members of the CCRB are selected, and a second proposal that's separate from that about the special prosecutor, and that those 2 are really, I understand you're in favor of both, but they seem like 2 distinct proposals that aren't necessarily interrelated. Do I have that right?
We wrote the legislation with those 2 entities combined, rolled into one sort of. But that being said, I'm not on our campaign's legislative working group, so I can get back to you with more detail about how that would go down the line.
No, sure. I guess I was trying to understand if you also wanted to change the scope of the CCRB's authority, separate and apart from changing how it's constituted.
Yes, we want to empower we want to replace the CCRB with an elected civilian review board, so it becomes the ECRB, and we want to empower them, so giving them the authority, which right now remains with the commissioner. We want to give them the authority to give disciplinary measures to police officers.
And if I could just also back up, just so I can understand your perspective here a little bit better. When it comes to how we select adjudicators, like members of a court, for example, there are different views. Some people think we should have a merit selection process. You look at the way the highest court in New York is selected. That's basically what we have. Other states, for their highest courts, they have elections. They elect the state Supreme Courts in Michigan and North Carolina. And I'm just curious if you could just say a little bit about why you think an elected board would be more likely to share what I gather are your views on police accountability, and why you think it wouldn't be the opposite. Why, an elected CCRB might actually be less sympathetic to the views that you have as compared to the one that's the one that we currently have.
Right, we did believe very strongly in democracy, so right now the CCRB is appointed, so the people of New York City do not get any voice in who sits on that board. If it was an elected board, I understand there are separate challenges in elections. We do understand that, but we do believe that we want to give the people of New York City that chance to, as community members, run for those positions. Community members who have firsthand experience with their police officers, we want to give them the chance to have a position like that, to have control over the police that polices their community. We believe very strongly in that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all very, very much. Our next panel, Walter South, Andrea Goldwyn, Sophie Meyerowitz, and looks like Terry Coudet, or Cood. Yes, proceed.
I'm a member of Community Board 9, and we have a bit of a problem. We're having a lot of condos being built, overbuilding in our community, and putting a burden on our infrastructure. So what's happening is they come in, build a building, sell the condos, and walk away with their profits, and they're not making any contribution to our infrastructure. We need, for example, our subway system, our bus system, our school system, etc. is now being overburdened with a number of new people coming into our community, and these developers are walking away and not making any contribution at all to this infrastructure problem. So I propose that we do away with as of right, period, and that there be a fee imposed upon every new building in our community, and this fee be determined by the community board as to what portion or what part of the infrastructure should be funded. That's it.
Hi, thank you, Commission, for hearing us out today. I'm Sophie Meyerowitz. I'm on East Village Community Board 3 as a public member of the Transportation, Public Safety, and Environment Committee. I stress public member because even as a relatively young person who's trying to get more civically engaged, I'm sad to say I was discouraged from applying for full board this year. I applied last year. Overall, I found the full board application and the group interview process chaotic. I also saw a lack of transparency in their brief and frankly very late rejection letter. I think the city needs to do a better job of articulating exactly why full members are chosen. Based on the number of returning full members who were reappointed this year, I can only assume that previous service on the board was part of that consideration. I agree with Councilmember Kalos' recommendation that we need term limits to ensure more of a diverse board and new perspectives in the constantly changing environment that is our city. We also need to ensure that we get those term limits, if we get those term limits, grandfathering does not allow those who have been in service for decades to add another 10 years to their time on the board. Finally, I think we need access to urban planners as community boards. As somebody who cares deeply about street safety and accessibility, I don't want to have to wait for DOT to perform studies and create mock-ups before our board can vote on crucial street improvements. The board should be able to come up with some of these plans of its own volition, which would expedite needed safety improvements and align with Vision Zero priorities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chair Perales and Commission members. I'm Andrea Goldwyn, speaking on behalf of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Our president, Peg Breen, wanted to be here tonight and sends her regards. The Conservancy is a 45-year-old organization dedicated to preserving, revitalizing, and reusing New York's architectural resources. The land use issues that this commission has discussed are central to our work in preservation and planning. We understand that this body intends to defer consideration. However, given the critical nature of these topics, we wanted to respond to the preliminary staff report. New York's Landmarks Preservation Commission is one of the strongest and most effective preservation agencies in the country. Its protection of historic resources was integral in reinvigorating the city's economy after the dark days of the financial crises in the 1970s and 80s. In the recent boom years, it's been a balance, working to maintain the dynamic mix of old and new that makes New York unique. The Conservancy's own study on the economic impacts of landmark designation found tremendous benefits. More than $800 million is invested annually in New York's historic buildings, creating 9,000 jobs every year. This success leads to the conclusion that the LPC should absolutely continue as an independent agency. The Landmarks Law charges it to safeguard buildings and places that stabilize and improve property values, foster civic pride, protect and enhance the city's attractions to tourists, and strengthen the economy of the city. These goals are just as relevant now as when the law was written 50 years ago. We believe that the LPC would be even more successful if there was a requirement that the commissioner, perhaps even the chair, have a background in preservation. When the law was established, this was a new field, so the requirements were sensible. In the decades since, the field of preservation has been professionalized, with several academic programs that have created thousands of alumni. The LPC's preservation staff is required to have a degree. It should be a prerequisite for an appointed commissioner. On the larger planning issues, we've heard, as you have tonight, from constituents across the city who say that their voices are not being heard when it comes to new development in their neighborhoods, that the Department of City Planning zones but doesn't plan. We urge this and future commissions to consider a more comprehensive approach. We should have a planning agency that considers a community's needs, its existing resources, and its capacity, and then makes decisions based on those factors, instead of the current system, which relies on uncertain outcomes and negotiations with developers. Until that large-scale change is realized, we believe that community boards need to be strengthened. We agree with others that these volunteer members should have assistance to address the extraordinarily complicated land use issues that they face. We support consistent citywide training and additional resources for boards to engage professionals as staff or consultants. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chair Perales, Vice Chair, and Commissioners. I'm Terry Cood, and I chair Community Board 2 Manhattan. We're delighted to welcome you to our district. Unfortunately, the late notice regarding this meeting prevents Community Board 2 from offering an official position, so today I'll be speaking for myself. Community Board 2 Manhattan is the board that has the longest serving community board member, Doris Diether, who has served on CB2 for more than 50 years. We have 3 or 4 others who have served more than 20 years. CB2 relies heavily on their experience, understanding of the often complex issues and regulations we face, and memory. For example, one of our members was on the board more than 20 years ago when some plots of land were acquired by the city and promised for a unique purpose. Over time, the agency changed what they were about to do, and they were about to renege on those agreements. Only the fact that one person's memory said, wait a second, this was promised as a park for this community that desperately needs a park, has prevented that from becoming another building site. The many issues addressed by our community board every month, including land use, landmarks, liquor licensing, sidewalk cafes, street use, transportation, social services, parks, environment, schools, the arts, and small businesses, are complicated, and it often takes years to master their subtleties and nuances. The community benefits from the combination of long-term experienced members, some who've been around for a few years, and the new members who bring a fresh perspective. Over the past few years, CB2 has had about a 10% turnover each year, and that has resulted in a highly functional board. It is important to consider that the elected officials who appoint us are term limited. And this, in itself, creates a national changeover point to fit the priorities of the new office holder, thus, by extension, generating a healthy turnover on the community board. I must say, burnout is more of a problem for community boards than long-term service. So please give community boards added resources so we can do our volunteer jobs month after month with the best support and expertise possible. And please allow our elected officials to do their jobs of appointing only those they feel will serve the needs of the board and the community for the 2 years, sometimes less if they're filling a vacancy, to come. It is a short enough time to keep the board as fresh and diverse as it should be without codifying a requirement to remove those that are valuable and important to the work we do for our communities. I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you. You were reading from your phone, were you? Did you?
She was.
Oh, but you have not submitted anything in writing?
Pardon me?
Have you submitted anything in writing?
No, I have not.
Be useful for us.
Okay.
You had a good idea? Good.
You know, Boston has done away with as of right, and they negotiate now with every developer to make contributions.
I asked you to put it in writing. The hour draws late, but I am interested.
Thank you.
And let me thank all of you. It's been very helpful.
Thank you.
That's 5.
We have one last panel. Ken Brown, Deborah Brown, Billy Freeland, Jonah Eaton, and Kay Samuels. Looks like MD. Okay, let's begin.
Thank you very much, Chair Corrales, distinguished members of the panel. Thank you very much for offering me the opportunity to present testimony. My name is Ken Brown. I am both a resident of East Harlem, Community Board 11, and I have the privilege of serving as the district manager of Community Board 5 in the Bronx. I'd principally like to address the questions of term limits and capacity at the community board. It has been a contentious issue of term limits at our board and anecdotally other boards. However, the objection, or one of the considerations that's been raised about imposing term limits, is the question of institutional memory. It's my observation that institutional memory is not necessarily required to be resided at the community board, and that the longevity of officers at the district manager's office can function as a surrogate and as a resource for that institutionalized memory, which is a principal resource for the board. I certainly concur that a great benefit that could be had to the functioning community boards in terms of its advisory capacity for land use questions would be greater access to technical assistance. It's been my observation in our board in the Bronx that the board will vote on questions of zoning and upzoning, and the consequence of that vote will not really sink in until after the fact, when residents find, as people have testified, large buildings being put up next to their two-family home. So it's my consideration that if there could be, one of the recommendations identified in the report is a pool of land use planners that could be made available at the municipal level, at the citywide level. I think that that would have the potential to mitigate any possibility of conflicts of interest, because they wouldn't necessarily be rooted to the places that are under consideration. That's one. One of a primary source of friction at our community board is the question of fair share criteria regarding, I forget the exact term of our burdensome community facilities, homeless shelters. It's our understanding that the fair share criteria, we've been told, is for notification purposes only, and we'd like, I have a sentence, sorry. And it's our recommendation that we would like fair share criteria to waive the consideration of a homelessness crisis as a means to circumvent fair share criteria. And I can't talk anymore. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Billy Freeland. I am a former member of Community Board 2, a current member of Community Board 8, and a proud graduate of NYU Law School, so I'm glad to see so many NYU faculty and affiliates on this commission. I think it gives me a lot of confidence in your work. And I want to thank you all for the work you are doing.
Can you just tell us what neighborhoods they are, and same with you, which community boards, the neighborhoods, or what area of New York?
University Heights, Morris Heights, Tremont.
Community Board 2 is Greenwich Village, downtown, basically between 14th Street and Canal, from the Hudson to Bowery. CB8 is the Upper East Side, 59th Street to 96th Street and Roosevelt Island. So I wanted to thank you all for your service, because I think this is extremely important. It's long overdue to revisit the charter. I come here actually, I didn't even plan to speak. I sort of just jotted down some notes. It's only been since your preliminary report came out that I started really thinking about this more seriously, and I think it's not as interesting as the substantive points, but I come with some process concerns. The report came out on July 17th, and my concern is that it's simply not enough time for the community boards to really evaluate and form a unified and thorough opinion of what your recommendations are, particularly around community board reform. I know most community boards, if not all, do not meet in August, and I just sort of did an informal survey during this meeting. I think there's about 5 community boards in Manhattan that do not meet in July or August. So my concern is that because of the timing, the preliminary report coming out at the end of July, it's going to be finalized at the end of August, that this process is not as thorough, robust as it could have been. So my recommendation to you would be to find a way to either get that community board input in a hurry, or in your final report to note that the community boards have not been able to be as engaged in this process as would be ideal. That may be our fault to some extent, but it may also be the fault of the process. I have only 50 seconds left, so some brief thoughts just on the substance, since I have the time. I have found in my experience on the community boards that institutional knowledge, institutional memory is invaluable. I'm not here to say no term limits, but I am here to say that some of the best mentors I've had on community boards have been people who have been around for 10 years, 20 years, who really know the ropes, who understand land use in a way that most of us cannot. And again, we do not have a city planner on the boards, although that would be a good idea. I think there are rules in place that we could standardize and make more uniform that get at the issue that term limits is trying to get at. I think, as Ms. Chung said at your hearing, I think on the 19th of June, she's with CB3, it is a blunt instrument. So for example, section 2800B of the charter currently says for substantial absences of about 6 months, you may be removed from the board. If we can standardize that and make that more uniform, I think that
You've run out of time.
So thank you all for your efforts, and I hope you'll take this into account. Thank you.
Thank you.
My
Yes.
name is Deborah Brown, no relation to Ken Brown at the end of the table. You want civic engagement? Well, here I am. I am not on the board of anything. I'm not a chair of any office. I'm a representative of the Upper West Side and a concerned citizen watching my home and my neighborhood get ruined with the out-of-control development that's going on. The creep of super talls by the gross misuse of our zoning resolutions, the opaque Euler process, the deaf ears of BSA, and I realize that this is not the place where zoning laws, I know it's going to follow a separate approval procedure elsewhere. But the developers who have big money get their voices heard. They get what they want. How? We want a voice in the changes in our neighborhoods, in our homes. The great sense that we, the middle class, are no match for big money or big titles. We are frustrated and angry. We don't have the answers. I don't have the answers. But I've certainly heard a couple of people here, specifically MAS, Save Central Park, NYC, and there are others like Landmark West that have common sense answers. So I beg you that these are our neighborhoods and our homes and they're being ruined. So if we need changes to community boards, let's do it. If we need a new entity or office for residential engagement, let's do it. But the sense that we're not getting anything done is very much alive and well as far as like just normal people are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jonah Eaton. I'm also not really on the board of anything. I'm just a graduate student of physics who's really interested in sort of the math behind voting systems. And I just really want to register my support for the ranked choice voting system. To me, this is like a no-brainer. Ranked choice voting encourages politicians to broaden their appeal away from the extremes you find in primaries and allows voters to vote for third-party candidates without wasting their vote. And for anyone confused about the system, there are actually some really fantastic 5-minute explainers online in video form. And from a voter perspective, it actually is really simple. If you know how to rank your favorite ice cream flavors, you basically know how to rank your favorite candidates too on a ballot. I also wanted to register my support to any and all proposals to make voting easier. In particular, I think it makes a lot of sense to follow the footsteps in elections in Colorado recently, where they have a vote-by-mail system, where ballots are automatically mailed out to every single eligible voter, so voters can vote at their own convenience at home, where they have all the resources and time that they need to make an informed vote. I don't know about you, but I can spend an hour researching which stupid toaster to buy. And I think if people can get their ballots mailed to them at home, you would find people actually spending a lot more time researching which candidates that they want to put on their ballot. And lastly, I want the commission to ask if they've considered a single transferable vote system. This would be an alternative to the usual redistricting process. Anytime you have a winner-take-all system, as we have now, you run the risk of 49.9% of your district's population from being unrepresented. Also, winner-take-all systems are very susceptible to gerrymandering. Under a single transferable vote system, you would combine 3 to 5 winner-take-all districts into one larger district with actually 3 to 5 winners, where the winners are determined by your ranked choice voting. And that would ensure a lot more proportional representation and a lot fewer disenfranchised voters. This system has all the advantages of the ranked choice voting thing, but it also gives minorities an opinion and a voice without having to rely on some commission to draw some weirdly shaped district that would give that minority a majority. I should clarify, it's not some actually crazy new voting system. Elections in Australia have been doing this for the last 40, 50 years, and some places even further. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Catherine Samuels. I'm a physician, born and raised Harlemite. I just found out about this meeting by reading City and State earlier today. So I'm just going to go through a list of issues, and then I'll just have to write a little more concretely and submit it to the commission once I have a moment to really sit down and pull it together. First of all, I definitely support elections for community boards. This appointment thing does not work. All you have are little politicians supporting the bigger politicians. And it has hurt Harlem terribly, terribly. My community is being pushed out by real estate, sitting on property, not put building, moving buildings around between different real estate owners, putting black faces forward at the community board to represent buildings that they want to build, and you don't know who's really behind building the building until after it gets done. Making sure the rents are so high my community can't live there anymore. And senior citizens are just being pushed out completely, and this is Rebney doing all of this. It's almost as though they want to Parisianize Manhattan, so everybody else will have to live outside of Manhattan, and it just keeps going on and on until more and more people have to keep going further and further outside of Manhattan. I believe that real estate people can be consultants on boards, but they should not sit on boards, particularly on the land use committee, because once they get control of that, that's it. That's one thing. The next thing is that the renaming of streets and buildings. We have one group in particular that's been renaming streets and buildings in Harlem, and they say they're renaming it after historical black figures, but the community that is supposed to be responsible, let's say, for that street, sometimes they don't even know it's being renamed because the person that's getting the signatures is going all over the place to get these signatures. I think it needs to be very clear where those signatures need to be coming from so that that community, the local community, should be involved in who the street is being named for and the reason for it, not just somebody picking a name and going around and naming it just to be doing something. The other thing is that there needs to be a provision, for example, where we don't have NIMBY operating for Harlem. When the sewage plant went to, I believe, Board 1, they didn't want it, they sent it up to 2. 2 didn't want it, they sent it up to 3. And then finally it went to the Negroes in Harlem. And that's how that happened. That should not be allowed to happen, and something should be written so that that does not occur. You don't want it in your neighborhood, why are you sending it to us?
Dr. Samuels, you're going to have to...
I'll finish very quickly, I'm sorry. So that's something that should be written that because somebody doesn't want something in their neighborhood, they bounce it to who they think the poorer neighborhood is that can't fight back and keep it from their neighborhood. And the other thing is this. The community, New York City, should be able to create referendums and vote on those referendums. It should not have to go through the city council. And that should be written in the law and very clear. This business, if we want a referendum, it has to go through city council, is ridiculous. If city people want a referendum, for example, to recall politicians, we should have a right to put that for a vote and vote on it.
Your time is up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
I think I just failed to say I was speaking in my personal capacity and not on behalf of any community board.
Okay. Shelley.
May I ask a clarifying question for you two as well as the other CB chairs or members who are here? One of the suggestions and one of the things we've talked about is providing technical assistance to community boards around land use issues, and I'm wondering if you could give us an example of where that might have been useful, and very briefly.
Sure. Our community board just completed a rather extensive rezoning, the Jerome Avenue rezoning, and the Department of City Planning had a robust menu of design charrettes and community engagement. So on the one side of the table, you had literally a panel of credentialed city employees making presentations. On the other side of the table are community residents that do not have the technical expertise to appreciate what kind of questions should be asked. So a lot of the ability to engagement by the community is not sufficiently supported with technical expertise. If there was someone sitting on the community side of the table that had the education, that had the expertise, that was a credentialed planner, that could then inform how the community asks questions.
That's helpful, thank you. And
I'm Olivia Hampton, I'm the chair of CBA. We have no height zoning on 3rd, 2nd, 1st in New York and are trying to either create special districts or do something to stop the massive overdevelopment that's occurring in those communities. We feel outgunned because the developers have their urban people who work for them, and we don't have the ability without significant financial funds to be able to engage an urban planner who could help us in our quest to get some kind of height restriction or some kind of planning for that community. Furthermore, we have hired an urban planner with some funds, but we have a hard time finding someone who wasn't conflicted because of working for the builders. So we need to have not only urban planners, but dedicated planners for the benefit of the community. I just would like to address some of the people who spoke. Community boards are advisory only. When you feel that they don't represent the community in the fight against developers, it's because we can't. We are only advising the city insofar as the city wants to listen to us.
thank you very much, it's helpful.
Are there any questions, Deb?
This is for the community board folks as well. Can you respond to Dr. Samuel's suggestion that community boards be elected as opposed to appointed? I understand you're speaking in your individual capacity, but it'd be helpful to hear your response to that.
Sure, I'll go ahead. I understand where the sentiment is coming from. My concern is that if you look at a lot of elections that we currently have, and again, speaking in my personal capacity, I think the developers have a lot of advantages in those as well. And the devil's in the details. How do you have elections in which you don't get outgunned by those who have money? I can say from my personal experience on the community boards, they actually tend to often be, maybe not in your experience, but in the ones I've seen, they often tend to be more opposed to new development. On Community Board 2, I felt that was true, and currently on CB8. And listening to some of the more pro-development voices in our community, they often criticize the community board for having too many voices against upzoning and development. So I'm not sure that elections would result in better outcomes or better outcomes against developers. In fact, I worry that the outcomes might be a little bit worse. So something you'd really have to study, and I certainly would not urge you to put that to the ballot in November.
I think in 1, 2, and 3, you have a certain group in those community boards. I could see that, but in some of the other uptown community boards, you don't have that. And that's what I'm worried about, because I see what happened to Harlem. And when you're looking at plots that are just sitting there for years, and then all of a sudden the neighborhood starts to change, and the next thing, there's a building. First of all, somebody comes to the board, and they're black, and they're telling you about this wonderful building they're going to be putting up, and the next thing you find out that who's putting the building up really isn't a black person, and the rent's $2,000 or $3,000 a month. Well, who in Harlem is going to be able to pay that? So what you're really doing is pushing the people in Harlem out of Harlem.
I will just, to that point, add that I do think so much of the appointment process is determined by the city council person and the borough president.
I agree with
so,
that too.
I feel, I may be wrong about this, I do have a lot of confidence, for example, in Gail Brewer, and I think she tries to appoint people who have right judgment, but does the city council person, are they of the same philosophy?
As I said, I've seen this whole thing develop in Harlem. Yeah. And when your city council person is a real estate developer, life is very hard.
I think I've lost control of this meeting here. Are there any other questions from the commission? If not, I will entertain a motion.
Motion.
All those in favor? The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Just have those cards so I can give you. Great. Some good testimony.
That was one place that could have really been developed.
And Brad.
You guys meet in July?
No, as a matter of fact, I think that's
There's a federal housing discrimination lawsuit against the city right now. Basically, a group of black people, right? They applied for